6-year-old girl saved a plane from disaster after the pilot passed out at 15,000 feet. It was a bright, sunny morning when Flight 482 took off from Los Angeles, bound for New York. The passengers were a mix of business travelers, vacationing families, and a few solo adventurers, all unaware that this flight would soon become one of the most extraordinary stories in aviation history. Among the travelers was a young girl named Emily, just 6 years old, with wide brown eyes and a curious mind. She was traveling with her parents for a holiday, clutching her favorite stuffed bunny as she peered out of the window, fascinated by the clouds beneath her. Everything seemed normal as the plane ascended, the hum of the engines a steady reassurance to everyone on board. The flight attendants moved down the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, while the captain's voice occasionally came over the intercom, giving routine updates about altitude and estimated arrival times. Emily sat quietly, listening intently, though most of the passengers hardly noticed the little girl. It happened suddenly, almost without warning. At 15,000 feet, the captain, a seasoned pilot with over 20 years of experience, slumped forward in his seat. His co-pilot shouted his name, trying to shake him awake, but there was no response. The co-pilot's face drained of color as he realized the gravity of the situation. Medical emergencies on board were rare, but a pilot passing out mid-flight was every airline's worst nightmare. Panic began to ripple through the cabin as the realization spread: the plane was now without a fully alert pilot. The co-pilot struggled to maintain control, but a sudden jolt caused him to bump his head against the cockpit panel. Dazed and disoriented, he staggered, and the plane wobbled dangerously. The flight attendants rushed to the cockpit, but none had the technical knowledge to operate the aircraft. Meanwhile, in the back of the plane, Emily sat quietly, watching the adults around her grow anxious. She didn't fully understand the technicalities of flying a plane, but she had a keen sense of observation. From the corner of her eye, she had noticed the strange movements in the cockpit, the frantic gestures, and the fearful faces. In a calmness that surprised everyone, she tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, the pilot isn't moving. The plane is going to crash." Her mother, initially alarmed, realized Emily's observation was accurate. The co-pilot, still struggling to regain composure, had been unable to stabilize the aircraft. In a moment of desperate clarity, Emily's mother turned to the flight attendants and explained what her daughter had noticed. One of the attendants, trying to process the absurdity of the situation, asked, "What can a 6-year-old possibly do?" Emily, sensing the urgency, walked steadily toward the cockpit, her small hand gripping her stuffed bunny tightly. The flight attendants hesitated, but the plane was veering dangerously, and they had no other options. Emily climbed onto a stool to see over the cockpit panel and pointed at a large screen displaying the altitude and flight path. To everyone's astonishment, she began repeating phrases she had heard from cartoons and games about planes: "Push the buttons that make the plane go up. Turn the wheel to keep it straight." It was pure instinct, guided by an uncanny understanding of what she had seen adults do in simulations. The co-pilot, seeing a flicker of hope in the tiny figure before him, realized that if they didn't act fast, there would be no second chance. With Emily's guidance, her small fingers pressing the correct buttons and turning the yoke ever so slightly, the plane began to stabilize. Emily's calmness spread to the adults around her. The flight attendants directed the passengers to stay seated and remain calm, but their hearts were pounding. Every passenger's eyes were glued to the cockpit, watching the 6-year-old girl perform a task that seemed impossible. Minutes felt like hours as Emily continued her astonishing work. She had no formal training, yet her instincts, sharp observation, and fearless determination guided her hands. The plane slowly leveled off, the altitude stabilized, and the terrifying wobble ceased. She turned to the co-pilot and pointed at a button labeled "Autopilot," whispering, "Press that one." The co-pilot, almost in disbelief, did as she instructed, and the plane hummed steadily along its course. In the cabin, a mixture of relief and amazement filled the air. Passengers clapped softly, though many were still frozen with shock. Flight attendants whispered words of encouragement, telling Emily she was doing an incredible job. Emily, ever composed, simply nodded, as if it were all perfectly normal. Meanwhile, ground control had been alerted to the emergency. Air traffic controllers were in constant communication with the flight crew, guiding them through every step. But much to their astonishment, it was the little girl who was actually controlling the aircraft, following instructions and instinctively stabilizing the plane while remaining remarkably calm. Eventually, the co-pilot regained full consciousness and clarity. He looked at Emily, his eyes wide with disbelief. "You saved us," he said, his voice trembling. Emily smiled shyly, hugging her stuffed bunny. "I just wanted everyone to be safe," she replied softly. The remaining hours of the flight passed without incident. When the plane finally touched down safely at JFK Airport, the passengers erupted in applause. News crews and emergency personnel rushed to the scene, eager to meet the young heroine who had saved hundreds of lives. Emily, still clutching her bunny, became an instant sensation, her bravery celebrated around the world. In the days that followed, aviation experts analyzed the flight data in awe. They confirmed that Emily's quick thinking and fearless action had prevented a disaster that could have been catastrophic. Airlines praised her heroism, and she was invited to aviation events to meet real pilots, who treated her as one of their own, but Emily remained humble. She never boasted about what she had done. To her, it was simply common sense: notice the problem, stay calm, and do what needed to be done. Her parents, overwhelmed with pride and relief, often told her, "You saved lives today, Emily. You're our little hero." Emily's story became a symbol of courage, proof that bravery and intelligence are not measured by age. A 6-year-old girl had taken control when adults could not, proving that sometimes, the smallest hands can perform the greatest miracles. And though she returned to her normal life, the world would never forget the day a young girl saved a plane from disaster at 15,000 feet.